Okay, the end of the world. Let's do it. The overarching topic of our 3 evenings together has been Christian identity, Paul's letters, and thinking with Jews. The first lecture concentrated on theos, the second on syngonia, and in the course of those explorations, I pointed out distinctions between historical Jews and rhetorical Jews. Historical Jews were a regionally various ethnic archipelago spread across the empire and outside of it. Reconstructing their beliefs and behaviors is the historian's goal, achieved only imperfectly through appeals to as much ancient evidence as we can muster. The diversity revealed by the data, especially amulets and inscriptions, should not surprise us. Jews then were no more on the same page than they are now. Rhetorical Jews, by contrast, consistent and constant, were and are exactly that, rhetorical. They are virtual Jews, a means by which non-Jews made and make claims about themselves. Classical ethnographers, as Ben Isaac's book so fully explored, deployed Jews and many other ethnic groups as the other to articulate what was best about themselves. In ancient ethnography, even the ethnic stereotypes are stereotyped. That's Giddy Bohawk's line, not mine, but I had to steal it. Sometimes these figures are conjured positively as a way to critique one's own culture, but most of the time, negative characterizations prevail. Identity formation presents a perfect opportunity to make yourself look big by making somebody else look small. As with ancient pagans, so too with ancient Christians. They also deployed rhetorical Jews to shape and build their own identities. So too with modern scholars on Paul. Their Jews serve to anchor current theological convictions in a foundational past. In this way, the past, times foreign then, is colonized, comfortably domesticated for now. Sometimes rhetorical Jews are good Jews, as when they help to situate very early, very high Proto-Nicene Christology in Jerusalem on a Sunday morning in April of the year 30. But more often than not, they are bad Jews, illuminating by contrast what is good about Christianity. Modern theology, not ancient evidence, stands as their source. Their deceptive hope for healing works. I'm reading from a document written in German and published in 2014. Their, meaning the Jews, their deceptive hope for healing works closely linked the Jews with that systematic profiteer of works ideology, the Pope, who pretended that buying indulgences guaranteed a path to God. This quotation, again, 2014, almost 40 years after Paul and Palestinian Judaism. First century Jews are still being generated from Protestant polemics against 16th century Catholics. In this sense, Paul is New Testament scholarship's ultimate rhetorical Jew. But let's return to the mid-first century when time was supposed to end. Why were members of this movement convinced that this was the case? Why take the message out on the road? What indeed was the message, and how on earth did pagans and their gods ever become involved at all? I'm glad you asked. I begin with a generalization from the second lecture when we identified religion, relations between humans and their gods. Ancient people actually thought of as patrilineal practices. Keeping these practices honored the gods. Why bother doing that? Piety, love, ethnic locatedness, because we've always done this, because the whole city is doing it, and also, don't forget, Any God is more powerful than any human. Put another way, there was no such thing as a theologically neutral disaster. Earthquake, flood or famine, drought or disease, such events index divine displeasure. Better to keep heaven happy. Happy gods make for happy humans. I want to draw an obvious but often overlooked corollary to this principle. Ancestral practices focused on salus, Latin, or soteria, Greek. But this word does not mean what we think of as salvation, safety, immunity from hurt or violence, health, freedom from harm, survival, civic freedoms, and security. That's a run-through of the first 6 definitions in the Standard Lexica. Not salvation as a happy afterlife. Salvation in that sense never defined Second Temple Judaism, nor did it shape centuries of Jewish relationships with non-Jewish diaspora neighbors. Jewish ancestral practices, inherited protocols for benevolently aligning heaven and earth, articulated how to live Jewishly and thus how to please the Jewish God. Let me put this another way. Take Messiah and eschatology away from Second Temple Judaism, and most of Second Temple Judaism remains. Let me put it a third way. Most Jews, most of the time, were most likely not staying up late at night wondering whether the Messiah were going to show up. A second corollary then follows. Most Jews, most of the time, probably were not sitting around wondering, what is God going to do with all these Gentiles? These questions about ultimate salvation, about messiahs, and about non-Jews were some of the themes sounded in Jewish prophetic speculations about the end. If a community was convinced that some of those prophecies and some combinations verged on realization, then they embodied the commitments of Jewish apocalypse. Please remember Professor Collins's question to me yesterday. This is that point that she made more clearly yesterday. People who thought that these were about to be realized embodied the commitments of Jewish apocalyptic eschatology or immediate eschatology. The movement that formed around Jesus, both before and certainly after his lifetime, was such a form of Jewishness, intensely mutagenic messianism. Paul is absolutely convinced that he knows the time on God's clock, even though by the time we have his letters, the kingdom is already 2 decades late. I cannot answer the question why John the Baptizer and Jesus of Nazareth were convinced that God's kingdom was at hand. We know that earlier, the writer of Daniel was beginning to think that that might be the case. So also the teacher of righteousness. We know that Josephus, a generation after Jesus, blamed the outbreak of the war on locally widespread messianic convictions spurred by scriptural prophecy. How a resolutely civilian, Galilean exorcist and prophet came to be identified with such an end-time royal and martial figure is one of the abiding mysteries of New Testament scholarship. Resurrection from the dead was certainly a special dignity, but it did not confer messianic status on the honoree. Whatever the reasons his followers had for thinking that Jesus was a Messiah, resurrection in and of itself would not have been one of them. Raising the dead back to life was a known phenomenon in antiquity, and it's not a how-to, but there's more information in the first item on your handout. It was the stock and trade of celebrity Mediterranean healers, Jesus included. Resurrection in and into a glorified state, not back into regular life, occurred with some regularity to and with various lower pagan gods like the emperor or like the unhappily taxable god Ampharis. And item number 2 on your handout gives you some bibliography. In apocalyptic Jewish traditions, such transformations were linked to events at the end. I take this to be the burden of Paul's description decades later of pneumatic body in 1 Corinthians 15. For advocates of very high early Christology, Jesus' resurrection occasioned his followers' intuition that Jesus was uniquely divine and therefore uniquely identified with Israel's unique God. This, I have argued, was not a first-century thought to think, though by the 4th century it could be defended by appeals to first-century texts. But 4th-century appeals to first-century texts do not mean that first-century people were thinking 4th-century thoughts, or 16th-century thoughts, or 21st-century thoughts. I will return to this dynamic between history and theology, identity and ethnicity, sameness and difference at the end of this lecture. Jesus' followers' conviction that he had been raised and transformed, I think, gives us instead an index of the intensity of their expectation of a proximate end. In their tradition, that was when such resurrections were supposed to begin to happen. The chief take-home message of Jesus' resurrection, in other words, was not about Jesus' theological identity. I think it was about Jesus' prophetic authority. Jesus raised, in other words, reconfirmed his core prophecy. Jesus' resurrection meant that the general resurrection and thus God's kingdom was actually at hand. Again, 1 Corinthians 15 is a classic passage of that. Adding to their certainty would have been his followers' continuing experience of charismatic empowerment, speaking in the tongues of angels, casting out demons, working cures and deeds of power, divination and prophecy. These charismata were the effect of Jesus' pneuma within the individual members of his community. They, the charismata, were, and here comes the big thought for this part of the lecture. The charismata were an in-group form of second coming, Jesus' presence, confirming Jesus' status as a well-placed source of revelation. The community gathered or regathered in Jerusalem, and this core group continued to await the public manifestation of the kingdom. Eventually, according to Acts on Shavuot, Pentecost, the next pilgrimage holiday, but who knows, eventually they began to declaim the impending arrival of the kingdom from the outermost court of the temple compound, which makes sense because it was the social and architectural equivalent of Jerusalem's Forum. Jerusalem would remain the community's home for the next 4 decades. This suggests that the recent brutal execution of their leader notwithstanding, Jesus' followers were not particularly worried either about Pilate or about the priests. If that does not strike you as odd, it should. I'll return to that observation later. Still, something was not right, because still the kingdom didn't come. Time was not ending on time. Eventually, their committed conviction that Jesus' prophecy must be right propelled some of his followers back out onto the road to resume their interrupted mission to Israel. They fanned out from Jerusalem to the great coastal cities of Judea. It was then and there, this is the moment of dramatic reversal, it was then and there, to what I imagine was their surprise, that these apostles discovered something that in rural Galilee and in the villages of Judea had been outside of common experience. Urban Jewish communities in mixed cities held more than Jews. They also held pagans. Just as pagans visited with Israel's God in the temple precincts, so also they could be found affiliated variously in the synagogues of the Western diaspora. And you have some of the evidence for this on item 3 of the handout. There they joined with Jews while listening to biblical traditions sung out in their own vernacular, Greek. They participated variously in synagogue activities. They, these pagans, made donations, and luckily for us, they received inscribed donor plaques, and luckily for Morsebek, they received inscribed donor plaques in return. And Acmonia, a priestess of the imperial cult, Paul's contemporary Julia Severa, funded the construction of a synagogue building. Mixed eating, shocking. Mixed eating occurred on the beach at Pharos, according to Philo, when Alexandrian pagans joined with Jews to feast together annually in celebration of the scriptures' translation into Greek. Obviously, nobody had read Acts chapter 10 yet. Gentile town councilors involved themselves in synagogue activities and projects. One pagan city, Apamea, even minted coins that bore an image of Noah's Ark. Pagans participated in diaspora Jewish communities, and they participated as pagans. Julia Severa was an imperial priestess. Some adopted some Jewish practices. Grouchy outsiders, like Juvenal or Tacitus, mention Sabbath observance in particular. But these God-fearers also continued showing respect to their own gods. The centurion Cornelius in Acts 10 represents such a person. He prays to the Jewish God while, as an army officer, he would also and necessarily be involved with Roman gods as well. Diaspora Jewish communities evidently had no problem with such arrangements, and they obviously benefited from good relations with their immediate pagan neighbors, who were the popular majority within diaspora cities. And as long as it did not lead to what we call conversion, deserting the gods of the local urban group for the non-local God of the Jews, most pagans, most of the time, had no problem with this both and model of Judaizing behavior. Once the apostles brought their testimony and their confirming charismata to the synagogue, they not only persuaded some of its Jews, like Paul eventually, that the kingdom was fast approaching, they also persuaded some of the synagogue's pagans. What would eventually become what we call the mission to the Gentiles, I am suggesting, happened by accident. The mission to the Gentiles happened by accident. It was the unintended consequence of the mission to diaspora Jews. In Roman Judea, remember, in terms of resident pagans, both human and divine, the diaspora began in Caesarea. But what to do? How should these pagans be integrated into the movement? Here, the evidence of the Gospels coheres with the controversies that shape Paul's letters. Jesus had left no teachings on the matter. First of all, if he was mostly in rural Galilee and in villages in Judea, he wouldn't have bumped into that many pagans. And when he does bump into a pagan, Pilate, he doesn't tell him about the kingdom of God. This suggests to me that Jesus was thinking within traditional paradigms. God would take care of everybody else. Jewish prophets had enough on their plate dealing just with Jews. In their new situation, These apostles needed to improvise, and that is what they did. They welcomed these already Judaizing pagans into their new assemblies, which I picture, if you think of a Venn diagram, I see it as a small circle contained within the larger circle of the synagogue. But the synagogue's both-and model of Judaizing was not possible for them. They demanded a bigger and more radical form of Judaizing. These pagans absolutely could not worship their own gods anymore. By committing to Israel's God alone, these pagans were no longer pagans. But by not converting, men being circumcised, neither were they Jews. So what were they? They represented a population anticipated in some end-time prophecies. They were eschatological Gentiles. The apostles knew this to be the case because these ex-pagan pagans were also inspirited, thus empowered, with Jesus's pneuma. They too could work charismata that Paul will later detail in 1 Corinthians 12. Their very existence was another confirmation that the times were indeed fulfilled. This incorporation of ex-pagan Gentiles was a brilliant solution to what could have been a confounding problem. And the phenomenon itself represented a resounding validation of the movement's message. They're not being irrational to continue with the mission. But in terms of Gentile policy, as we learn from Paul's later letters, it also made a mess. Within 2 decades of Jesus' death, the movement was divided bitterly over precisely this issue. Paul trains his most bitter invective against those who, to the outside eye, would have seemed like clones of himself. Christ-following Jews going to pagans to incorporate them into the Christ movement in advance of the coming kingdom. Evidently, by mid-century, and what should have been the brief meanwhile between Jesus' resurrection and his definitive public second coming, some apostles sought to stabilize ex-pagan membership in Christ assemblies through circumcision. Paul did not like this idea. He was committed to a different model of pagan integration. His dispute with his Christ-following colleagues resulted in some of his nastiest comments about the law and about Gentile circumcision. And if you remember the question about Galatians 4 yesterday, Galatians 3, that's how to look at that Sarah-Hagar comparison. Neither option, circumcising or not circumcising, was a perfect solution. But there was no perfect solution. The situation was, after all, unprecedented. These people lived at the hinge of history. None of them thought that he or she had to plan for a long future. There would be no long future. Paul did not embrace diversity of opinion easily. And he tended to process pushback as, quote, persecution. As we see from his remarks in 2 Corinthians, which is number 4 on your handout, he felt that he endured a lot of it. Specifically, Jewish resistance to the message of the coming kingdom tends to preoccupy New Testament scholars, in part because it serves to highlight Christian theological ideas in a way that pagan resistance cannot. These theological ideas then generate the supposedly historical explanation. We have rhetorical Jews, once again, doing heavy historical lifting. Thus, Jews were scandalized by the message of a crucified Messiah because that implied a death cursed by God. Or, strictly monotheist Jews violently objected to the theological novel idea of identifying Christ with God. Or, so the once new perspective on Paul, Jews viewed Jewish members of the Christ assemblies as sinners. They were slackers with regard to Jewish religious principles because these assemblies permitted Gentiles to join, and they even ate with them. They were not ethnically proud or separate enough. Evidently, none of those Jews had ever been to the cookout in Alexandria. I've argued in print against mobilizing a single verse in Deuteronomy, namely 21:23, as an explanation for anything other than Paul's rhetorical pathway in Galatians, and I will not repeat my arguments here. Note, though, that Josephus, who often narrates stories about mass crucifixions, evidently didn't know anything about the curse, and since he doesn't like a lot of the revolutionaries who are being crucified, he missed an opportunity. And the experience of the Jerusalem community presents counter evidence to the argument. The community lived largely unmolested in the city for 40 years, while it also proclaimed a crucified Messiah. The same counter evidence also complicates the argument of the early extremely high Christology people. Were so-called Christ monotheism so transgressive, if it had even ever been possible to conceive, James and company would have been receiving 39 lashes all day, every day, for the next 40 years, but they didn't. Finally, the idea of strictly self-segregated Jewish communities within diaspora cities is a fantasy. Jews living in the cities of the Western diaspora, eo ipso, lived within pagan religious institutions. That's what an ancient city is. They routinely mingled with pagan neighbors, both human and divine. Every time they were present at horse races, poetry competitions, meetings of the town council, or going to the theater. Together with their pagan neighbors, they shared the public baths, the public loos, the public entertainments, the mixed professional guilds, and burial sites. Those who got good gymnasium educations dealt both with pagan gods in the curriculum as well as on the walls, and also with pagan persons, frequently undressed, just like in the baths. Priests ate with Roman legates in Jerusalem, even on the high holidays, which is when the Romans tended to be in town. Otherwise, they stayed in Tel Aviv, like any sensible person. In the diaspora, Gentile synagogue affiliations, both pagan and Christian, continued for centuries, much to the annoyance of watching bishops like Chrysostom, and some of that is in item 3 again of your handout. Let's ask our rhetorical Jews to step to one side. What explains the behavior of resistant historical Jews, with Paul on both the giving and receiving ends of this resistance? What is most striking about the woes that he lists in his passage in 2 Corinthians is the range of Paul's persecutors. The 39 lashes was a synagogue disciplinary action, one that the recipient had to consent to accept. Punishment implies inclusion. Sanders' soundbite. But also, if somebody were not willing to submit to synagogue discipline, they could walk away. Beating with rods was a Roman juridical punishment. Stoning is the act of a mob, ethnicity and thus religious orientation unknown. Still, in the diaspora, urban mobs were most likely pagans. High winds and rough waters are the domain of lower cosmic gods. The God of this age was blinding the minds of unbelievers, complains Paul. False brothers, he says, are reaching out to his assemblies, advocating proselyte circumcision, and thus, as far as Paul is concerned, questioning his authority. What is motivating all of Paul's persecutors? I blame the gods. Fundamentally, the gospel created a security problem. Disrupting relations between gods and their humans risked divine wrath. For this reason, both Roman magistrates and pagan populations actively resisted the apostles' activities. But diaspora Jewish communities were also implicated. They were the source of the new movement's God-fearing pagans, and they were the first port of call for sojourning apostles. Synagogue authorities accordingly, if only occasionally, worked to dissociate themselves from this disruptive message. Alienating the gods put the city at risk. Alienating the pagan majority put the city's synagogue at risk. All of this hostility, in Paul's view, quote, persecution, from Roman magistrates, from irate pagans, from diaspora synagogue authorities, and Paul was convinced from the nation's gods themselves, was the social consequence of this apocalyptic movement's production of eschatological Gentiles. Gentiles who, as Gentiles, worship the Jewish God alone. To those within the movement, these harassments ultimately did not matter. The eschatological Gentiles themselves proved that Christ was on the verge of coming back and subduing all these lords and gods. So when does Christ return? Soon, says Paul. How soon? Paul expects the parousia within his own lifetime, at least, according to number 6 on your handout. That is what he says. We shall not all sleep, but we will all be changed. We are awaiting the Lord's parousia, Philippians 3:20. We who are alive, who are left, will be caught up and transformed, the dead resurrected. 1 Thessalonians. History, teaches Paul, is moving quickly toward its finale. The appointed time has grown very short. The form of this world is passing away. And upon Paul and his community, the ends of the ages have come. You have the references on the handout. Please note the past completed action of the verb. The ends of the ages have come. Time's happy ending, the establishment of God's kingdom through the agency of his dead, raised, and therefore soon returning Messiah, is assured. What happened then? In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul speaks of pneumatic transformation. The bodies of flesh become bodies of pneuma. Pneumatic bodies rise, to speak scientifically and specifically for the moment. Such bodies dwell in the realm above the moon. Redeemed humanity gets the same sort of body, the morphe tou theou, a God form, that Jesus had before his cosmic descent, according to Philippians 2:6. The transformation into spirit by spirit was already underway, both for ex-pagan Gentiles and for those Jews, the present remnant, who know that the Messiah had already come, been crucified, been raised, been transformed, and was about to come back. Once the Messiah manifests from Zion, the plenum of the 70 nations, and all Israel, all 12 tribes, another eschatological idea, all of them will be transformed. Where does everyone go? Ad astra, to the heavens. That's a good ancient Mediterranean idea. Will there still be distinctions of ethnicity, gender, and social class? once bodies are made of pneuma. In Galatians 3:28, Paul seems to say no. In Romans 15, he seems to say yes, at least in terms of ethnicity. Is he talking about the same eschatological phasing? I don't know. What about gender? Look, I don't even know how to make sense of circumcised angels, and they also have pneumatic bodies. Gods are male and female, and they have star bodies too. My sense from the few letters that we have from him, some co-dictated with colleagues, my sense from these letters is that Paul was not a detail guy. What he does know, first of all, is that he is right and that the times are verging on the end. The kingdom is at hand. There is a workaround to Paul's urgent eschatology. Paul claimed merely that Jesus was coming back. Indeed, that Christ could return at any time, but he didn't actually say when. This anxiety about the lag in Paul's timekeeping also characterizes scholarly resistance to seeing Jesus as meaning something millenarian when he proclaims that the kingdom is at hand. And on this resistance, I invite you to look at Dale Allison's work on the historical Jesus. But John the Baptizer's timekeeping had also been off. And so was that of the teacher of righteousness. And so was that of Joachim of Fiore. And so was that of Sabbatai Tzvi. And of William Miller. I fail to see why this should be so unsettling. Nobody's been right about the time of the end yet, except perhaps the scientists now, and that end is being brought about by us, not by God. And furthermore, the Pope is the only one I know whose job description includes a clause about infallibility, and that only started in 1870. The claim that Jesus may return at any time is indeed logically distinct from the claim that Jesus will return soon. That logical distinction has the virtue of leaving history with a lot more time on its hands, and it conforms, happily, to the ways that things did indeed work out. That observation represents a theological opportunity, not a historical claim, because Paul does say soon. He uses the past perfect tense when he speaks about the ends of the ages. He says we and us and we the living when he speaks of those who will witness Christ's return. The Thessalonians got their impression that no one of their assembly would die before the parousia from someone, and that someone was Paul. He did not correct or qualify their impression. Instead, he reassured them that things were indeed on track. Paul himself measured time between now and soon. With one last shout out to Schweitzer, I close on this topic with a thought from the great scholar, pastor, and preacher, Bishop Christer Stendahl, who, good Lutheran theologian that he was, commented on Romans, and that text is in your last handout item. Christer says, if the text says now, in the year 56 of the Common Era, where does that leave you and me? It leaves us almost 2,000 years later. No charismatic gamesmanship can overcome this simple fact. Allow me to conclude by returning to the meta-themes of this year's Shaffer lecture: sameness and difference, ethnicity and identity, theology and history. It is true that an intelligible line can be traced from Paul through Nicaea to Augustine to Luther and thence to Martin Hengel, and then to the early, extremely, incredibly high Christology people. One that resonates with the idea of the radical identification of Jesus with God. That is true. But that is not an argument for or about the first century interpretation of a first century text. It is an observation about the continuing importance and thus about the necessary reinterpretation of a first century text. The history of exegesis cannot establish that a later idea existed in the first century just because later theologians interpreted first century texts to make their later case. Think again about Sungania. The language of genealogical descent moves from then to now, but the actual construction of the line of descent, whether it is biological or theological, runs from now back to then, the sacred foundational past. And that past is reimagined through modern theological criteria. For this reason, in much New Testament scholarship, the past is too important to be allowed to exist. Messy, unobliging historical data are disregarded. Textual exegesis is so much cleaner than doing history. Here is where we come to the real parting of the ways between doing history and doing theology. Theology, especially New Testament theology, is textual. It proceeds through exegesis. It bases itself on received canonical text interpreted through the lens of doctrine. This is why there is so much Christian difference. This is why different churches have different teachings and different readings of Scripture. Different churches have different inherited ancestral practices too, and these are usually patrilineal too. History, by contrast, is contextual. It requires the sympathetic and critical reconstruction of the ancient world, pulled together from everything we can lay our hands on. Such a reconstruction of interpretive context can never be achieved by explicating the text we want to interpret. Peering closely at a text can never give us its historical context. Doing history requires a lot of peripheral vision, the coordination and the critical assessment of as vast an array of materials and as many media as we can possibly assemble. And if we want to find out what ancient people thought, that's what we have to do. Exegesis-based arguments domesticate Paul's letters for later centuries of theological doctrine, and that's fine. But do not mistake this for historical description. To do history when we read Paul means having to go outside of his letters. It also means getting outside of the Septuagint's echo chamber. You can't say Paul must mean this because, look at Deuteronomy says that. What it means is reimagining his context. His immediate personal religious and cultural context is one of a messily improvising, idiosyncratically apocalyptic and tiny movement within late Second Temple Judaism in his lifetime. His larger social and cultural context is the Eastern Mediterranean cities of the early Roman Empire. Reading Paul historically means further realistically imagining his audiences and assessing his goals in communicating with them. It means interpreting him by reimagining them as they lived their lives within their native religious institutions, the Greco-Roman city. To do history is not to do theology. What is the difference, and how are they related? Because they are. Theology, even historically sensitive theology, ends by expressing the traditions of its author's religious community. That's the work of theology. And that community lives in the present while drawing on texts, Old Testament and New Testament, bequeathed to us from the past. Theology is a kind of time machine. Updating these texts, retrieving them from intellectual obscurity or ethical irrelevance, rendering them meaningful to the contemporary church, or rather, churches. Catholics will see something different in these texts than Protestants. Protestants will see something different from Ethiopians, Copts from Greek Orthodox, and so on. Different churches have different doctrines and thus different traditions of interpretation. And in this way, they have different Bibles. Ecumenical theology has to respect those differences. They are real. But what a text meant cannot but be different from what it within a current community means. And the thought of Christers that Laura began our evening with together speaks to that. What a text meant is not the same as what it means. The Renaissance is the point of origin for this vital distinction. The creation of the scientific creation of and reimagining of the past. The Renaissance is the point of origin for much else. Modern science, the sun-centered solar system, critical historiography, the beginnings of the footnote, one of my personal favorites, commitment to research in primary languages, textual criticism, and of course, for Protestantism. Within that highly charged intellectual climate, Protestant theology legitimated itself by appeals to the then new history, a shining new criterion of legitimacy and meaning. Luther, as far as Luther was concerned, was not simply defying the Pope. He was not constructing a new theology at all. He was simply recovering what Paul actually meant. And what Paul actually meant, Luther urged, was justification by faith alone and not by works of the law. New Testament Jews and their current Catholic proxies, as well as Luther's Jewish contemporaries, could be felled in one blow. But the criterion is coming out from the invention of the modern idea of history. Criteria of theological legitimacy still seem pinned to some version of this type of historicism. A modern theological thought, like post-ethnic universalism, is somehow not legit unless Paul, or Jesus, himself had that very same theological thought. This is the prime reason, I think, why so many New Testament scholars keep discovering a first-century Protestant Paul. The past is used to validate the present. I want to point out that you do not have to be a Protestant to come up with a Protestant Paul. Alan Siegel and Danny Boyarin have as well, and that's because they're reading the canonical New Testament scholarship and validating Jewish difference by saying that Christianity has always been something else. Rhetorical Jews, conjured as Paul's contemporaries, sharpened theological focus. Jews didn't like Gentiles. Jews kept to themselves. Jews were virulently, even violently, focused on ritual purity. Or they were strictly monotheist, which is a good thing, but after the year 30, they were too monotheists, which is a bad thing. Churches are trans-temporal communities. They stretch from Jesus and Paul to now. Identity is contiguous thanks to the ligature of theology. Theology, in this sense, inscribes identity. History unsettles identity. What Paul thought, reconstructed historically, will always line up more closely with what any other first-century person thought, even if that person were an Egyptian magical adept, a devotee of Cybele, a Roman senator, a Jewish high priest, or a female Nubian enslaved person. To do history, in short, requires acknowledging and respecting difference. Ethical theology does too. Be secure enough in your own religious identity not to caricature any other peoples of any historical period. And for Christian theology in the West in particular, this means don't invest your religious identity in caricatures of Jews. It's hard to do when you have to come up with an Easter sermon. Don't do it. Stop picking on the Pharisees. Don't do it. On this point, I leave you with a tradition passed down from within my own Sicilian, Catholic, matrilineage, a wisdom saying from Ursilia Borelli Fredriksen and Sebastiana Poliafito Borelli, my mother and my grandmother, also working moms, although they worked in factories, not in universities. Hold this thought. You do not make yourself look big by making someone else look small. On this point, ethical theology and ethical history work together, and they are joined. Theology refamiliarizes Paul's letters in important and productive ways when it is done ethically. History defamiliarizes Paul's letters, and it should. This is because ancient people were not modern people, and they lived in a world utterly different from ours. We should mind the gap and respect it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fredriksen. So we have time for a few questions. If you'd like to pose one, we have a microphone. I'll call on you. Please just identify yourself quickly and pose your question.
Hello, my name is David. We've chatted. MAR New Testament. I'm still trying to formulate my question. Perhaps I need to email you at 2 a.m. But thinking,
you can make a comment if.
Well, so thinking through your understanding of Paul's theology and the way he's responding to different churches and different apostles as being kind of on the fly and making it up as he goes, because it's this new thing that has never happened before, and what do we do with it in the eschatological end? How do you understand Paul's methodology for interpreting the Hebrew scriptures? Because when we look through Galatians and things like that, he's specifically making arguments towards the Gentiles from the Hebrew scriptures. And so I'm interested to see what your thoughts are on why Paul does this, why it's even necessary, and how he understands his use of the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures.
Remember, it's not the Old Testament. Yes. There's no New Testament yet.
I was thinking of Richard Hayes's book, Use of the Old Testament and the New Testament. That's kind of where that's coming from. But yeah, his understanding of the Hebrew scriptures, specifically, he's using Genesis.
I don't think Paul can read Hebrew either, so the Septuagint. I wouldn't connect the word methodology with someone like Paul. He's improvising. He's also charismatically empowered, and he's had a vision of the transformed pneumatic Christ. And he's doing, if you look at the way he reads Scripture as a type of divination, he's reading Scripture to understand what God is doing now. And he knows he's right because, as he tells his Corinthian community, he speaks in tongues more than any of them. And as he tells another Gentile community in Philippians, he was an A+, absolutely, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. So he knows his stuff. And he says that the super apostles think they're Hebrews. Well, so am I. So, and it goes on and on. But he's not a member of the SNTS. Thank God. He's not a member of the SBL. He's living in an apocalyptic messianic movement that's changing as its central prophecy is failing. And he's in the generation where that's still not a failure, because the accommodation of this movement to eschatological Gentiles is validating them in their conviction that the sand is running out on history's clock. So how is he reading? God's logia, as he calls it, the oracles of God? They're divinatory texts for him. And how does he know that they're true divinatory texts? Because they're the texts of his God. And his God, Paul is an ancient Jewish monotheist, is the biggest and the best God, which is why his son, the Messiah, is going to come and defeat all those other gods.
Did Paul believe Jesus was a warrior Messiah in service of God the Father?
Well, that's sort of the way he describes him. If again you look at 1 Corinthians 15, he destroys. He's not even rehabilitating them. In Philippians 2, all those superhuman needs are subdued, but they're rehabilitated. They're included in 1 Corinthians 15. Those cosmic rulers and authorities and powers are destroyed. So Paul gets carried away with his own rhetoric. I appreciate that it happens in a talking profession, and he was in a talking profession. If you look, not that being a charismatic messianic apostle to pagans is a profession, but yeah. And let me mention this book. I think I've mentioned a couple of times now, by Matthew Novenson, The Grammar of Messianism. There are like 10 different types of categories of things that show up in different combinations when you're saying that somebody kind of looks like a Messiah. And but the appeal of a Davidic lineage and this defeat, coming back and defeating cosmic powers, is a Martian. No more Mr. Nice Guy. So there's this gap in time where Paul's doing the best he can to turn ex-pagans into pagans. Because I have a question for you guys as I speak again. I know my own. I know what I want to be true, which makes me suspicious of whether it is true. I love Romans 11 when, Romans 9-11. I'm so happy he had that thought and he wrote it. The fullness of the nations and the 12 tribes of Israel, all Israel will be saved. Is that everybody? Because who are the idolaters against whom the wrath of God is going to be delivered? Does that mean only 10 people from each of the 70 nations? That mean what is he talking about? I'm a Massachusetts Democrat. I want Paul in Romans to be saying that all humanity is redeemed. And this is one of the reasons why Origen of Alexandria, this later church father, who says that God loves all his creatures, so that, and God has all the time in the world, so that ultimately he'll put Satan in enough of a learning situation so that even Satan will turn again in love of God, and even Satan will be redeemed. I love that. But I live in Boston, so I don't know.
I think it's a great note, since we started on Augustine, went to Paul, and have now come back to Origen. Pretty hard to beat that. Would you please join me in thanking Professor Fredriksen for these lectures?
Thank you very much. Thank you.